So let's go ahead and talk about white space and get up a basic, very quick layout here. Now for this layout, we're going to be reusing it to demonstrate all of the fundamentals going forward. All right, so white space. Basically, it is the empty areas in a user interface. That's basically the most simple definition that I could come up with to describe white space at this point in time. And of course, we're going to elaborate on it further and also how to apply it. So where would the white space, or it's sometimes referred to as the negative space, where would it be applied in this design? Where could you find it? Well, again, it's the empty areas. Let's click on this to help visualize. All right, so these red areas you could consider being the white space or the negative space. All right, so it's all around our elements or our components. All right, so this is another easy way to visualize, all of the white space. So why is white space important? Well, if we get rid of the white space, this is what happens to our design. It basically just kind of falls in on itself. Think of it like as the bones to your skeleton. All right, to your body. If you get rid of your bones and your cartilage, you would just pancake out. So you need your bones and you need your white space if you want to have good user interfaces. All right, so how do you apply white space? All right, well, there's 4 considerations: your space availability, the number of components, alignment, and consistency. All right, so let's take a look at each one of these in relation to the design that we're looking at. All right, so our space availability, really, it depends on several different factors. First, the viewport width. All right, so if you don't know what the viewport is, basically on a desktop, you have a browser. It's all the area inside of that browser, with exception to like the URL bar and stuff like that. It is basically, if you know what HTML is, it's the body element. It is your entire frame of your app or your web design, or basically your user interface. All right. On a phone, you don't have as much of that viewport width or that space available to you to design for. So that's going to impact your decision. But that's not the only consideration that you have. For instance, look at this little element. We can call this a component inside of our design. How much space do we have available inside of it? So as you can see, this can cascade, and your space availability is really important when applying your white space. Now, what about the second? That's the number of components. So we know how much space we have available. How many components are we dealing with? All right, so everything outside of your white space could be considered a component or a micro component. So this is a component, this title. We have a paragraph. We can call this a component in and of itself. And maybe this dash could be considered a micro component. We have this button container, or this sort of just this element here with a button inside of it, depending on how you look at it. And we have this dash here. So the number of components will also obviously influence how you apply your white space. For instance, if you have a phone and you're looking at a splash page, which is just a real simple page of a website, maybe it only has 2 elements, a title and a button to enter. Well, you're going to be able to have a lot of white space. Well, what about on a desktop and you have a magazine news style sort of website where you have tons of information and articles? That means you have tons of components. Well, you're not going to be able to have a lot of white space. Next up is alignment. So how you apply your white space needs to be considerate of the alignment that you have going on. So for instance, we could see this column here is basically created by the white space. And again, the white space is invisible, but it gives you structure in terms of this column right here. What about over here? Well, we can see these 2 lines, or these dashes, are lined up perfectly. And then we have this one over here that's aligned here, but what about down here? Book a trip is offset by about 20 pixels or so. We need that moved over because we have a pattern here. We have a dash text, dash text. All right, so alignment is very important, and it plays out in many different ways throughout a design. This is only just 2 examples that I showed you here. And what about consistency? Well, if the goal is to take these 2 components, or if you could think of it as just a button, this would be a component with a micro component here. we want to, for instance, if the goal is to center it vertically and horizontally within this white container, well, let's take a look at the width. All right, we have this much white space defined here, but we only have that much white space defined there. So we really need to move that in order to make it nice and consistent in terms of how we apply our white space. And so it sounds simple, but we really need to give ourselves a lot of practice in order to nail white space as much as possible. And we're definitely going to be doing that through videos, of course, with the courses as well, the tests and the challenges going forward.